Welcome back everyone. The iPad 9th generation just came out, so let's go and compare it against the iPad 4, the iPad Air 4 actually, and see which one you should go and pick up. Now, if you have all the money in the world, I think the iPad Air 4 is that better valued iPad. It's a much better iPad in my opinion, but the iPad 9th generation could potentially be a better valued iPad because it is a little bit cheaper, at least in the brand new market. Even in the used market, obviously it's going to be cheaper. You're probably going to be getting a better valued iPad from the 9th generation iPad, but that iPad Air 4 does have more features overall, and I'm a huge fan of the iPad Air 4 and the value that you're getting with that iPad. Now, if you want to pick up either one of these things, links will be down in the description. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the same time. Now, on the front of the iPad 9th generation, you have a 10.2-inch Retina IPS panel. The resolution is fairly high. It's almost the same thing as the iPad Air 4, but it is a smaller panel, so do keep that in mind. Now, they don't really feel like crazy big differences because the iPad Air 4 has, less bezel on it, but that 10.2-inch iPad's panel isn't that bad, and they actually implemented True Tone on this specific panel now, so the 9th generation iPad now has that capability, which is a very cool feature. The iPad Air 4, on the other hand, has a 10.9-inch liquid Retina IPS panel, and the brightnesses go up to the same, which is great, but the resolution is slightly higher, even though you're getting more pixels per inch on the iPad 9th generation. Does it matter? Not really. The iPad Air 4 also has True Tone. Now, when it comes down to both, I highly prefer the, iPad Air 4's, type of design. Like I mentioned before, I've always preferred it. I think it's one of my favorite things ever. I think with the iPad 9th generation, they are still similar because they both have like the gesture-based design, which is great, but I still like the iPad Air 4's design and everything going for it. So when it comes down to both, I would definitely say the iPad Air 4 is a better looking one. On the bottom, a little bit of a difference as well. The iPad Air 4 has the flat sides all across it. The 9th generation iPad has a little bit of a curved side, which is great. The lightning port on the 10.2-inch iPad with the headphone jack. The iPad Air 4 has that USB Type-C port, which is perfectly fine. I like seeing that kind of stuff as well. And on the back, aluminum backs on both these iPads, like I mentioned before. And I've never felt a cheap iPad. Apple's never made a cheap feeling iPad. So when it comes down to both of these, both of them feel extremely premium. They feel great, and you're not going to feel like one feels cheaper than the other one, although I think the iPad Air 4 is probably the more premium feeling one when it comes down to it. Now, moving on to the camera side of things, this is actually kind of interesting. So on the back, you have a 12 megapixel single sensor on the iPad Air 4, and you have an 8 megapixel single sensor on the iPad, 9th generation. Now, when it comes down to both of them, the back camera is theoretically better on the iPad Air 4. You do have 4K at 60 capability on the iPad Air 4, which is tremendous. So that is essentially like an iPhone XR camera. I think that's the closest relevance I can give to it. It's a wide angle lens. It looks great. And, although it is on an iPad and it's not like a tremendous camera, it's not competing with the iPhone 13 Pro Max or anything, it's still a pretty good single sensor. And for an iPad, it's actually not bad. And with the iPad 9th generation, this is equivalent to like an iPhone 6 camera on the back. I mean, 1080p at 30 is really not doing anybody any favors. It's definitely a little bit outdated, but here's the crazier thing. On the front side, this is where they kind of flip-flop. On the iPad Air 4, you have a 7 megapixel standard lens, 1080p, 60 frames per second, which is great. It's typical what you'd expect. But on the iPad 9th generation, we now have a 12 megapixel ultra-wide sensor that also goes up to 1080p at 60. So you're getting a much more enhanced, upgraded front-facing camera on the iPad 9th generation than on the iPad Air 4. Now, is that a big difference? Technically, I mean, it depends how much you use your cameras on your iPad, but a really cool feature of the 9th gen iPad is that center stage capability. So what that does is essentially if you're on a FaceTime call, it'll always track you if you're moving around, and that's what benefits with the ultra-wide sensor. I guarantee you the next generation of iPad Airs are probably going to bring it too, but as of right now, the 9th generation iPad has it, and I'm a huge fan of it. I'm here for it. So when it comes down to the cameras, I will still side with the iPad Air 4. I think that is the better camera sensor overall. But that iPad 9th generation is still a very solid camera for sure, and I'm glad they improved the front camera. Now they just need to do the back camera. Now, in terms of longevity between both of these, like which iPad is going to outlast the other one, as of right now, the iPad Air 4 is still going to outlast the iPad 9th generation, even though it's the older one, and you might be asking yourself why that's the case. Well, because the iPad Air 4 has a newer chipset than the iPad 9th generation. So what that means is, as most of you know, Apple actually goes ahead and they plan their updates accordingly to the chipset inside of that device. So it doesn't even matter if one is newer than the other one. There's been a lot of times, like in this case, a device will come out a year after with an older chipset because this was a kind of like a flagship of last year, an iPad Air 4, kind of like a mid-tier flagship. The 9th gen iPad is technically cheaper than it. So the Mini 6, the iPad Mini 6, Even though the iPad Air 4 is more expensive than it, the Mini 6 could outlast it because of that newer chipset. So in this specific case, the iPad 9th generation is not going to outlast the iPad Air 4, even though it's newer, just because of that chipset inside of it. So that's a pretty big thing to keep in mind there. Now ending it off with the performance, well, we're going to hit on battery life too, but performance side of things, the iPad Air 4 has that Apple A14 Bionic chip inside of it with 4GB of RAM, where that iPad 9th generation has that Apple A13 Bionic chip inside of it with 3GB of RAM. So starting off with the Air 4, like I've said before, that performance has been really good. I've done a lot of different things with it, and it's been a pretty good experience. If I was somebody and if I just needed an iPad to not only do notes, for school or, edit up documents and those type of things, but even going up to like slight video editing, editing photos and batch, categories and all this other stuff, or even like somewhat intensive gaming, like this is a really good, well-rounded iPad. That A14 Bionic chip inside of it is great. This is pretty much the same type of performance you're going to get on an iPhone 12. It's essentially almost the same thing, and with that extra gig of RAM on the iPad Air 4 over the 9th gen iPad, you're getting another cool little update in that sense too. So when it comes down to both of these, the iPad Air 4 is definitely more well-rounded iPad that's definitely going to give you more performance than the 9th generation iPad. But here's the thing, the 9th gen iPad is still a very good performing iPad as well, and I'm actually pretty surprised how good of a performing iPad it is. Really, everything I've done with it has been perfectly good. I haven't really ran into too many issues with it. Of course, it is kind of a little bit, maybe it's a little bit slower than what you'd expect when you compare it to like an Air 4 or an iPad Pro like the M1 iPad, but that still doesn't mean that this thing is a horrible performing iPad. And here's the thing, iOS is so smooth that even if you're rocking like an iPad like 5 or something, it still kind of feels smooth because of the iOS and its optimizations, or iPadOS in this case. So specifically for students, if you want to get an iPad for school and notes and all that stuff, this is perfectly fine. Both of them are going to do fine. If you're trying to do like video editing and stuff, both of these are going to be fine too. But the more and more demanding your tasks are, if you're trying to expect to replace your laptop with an iPad, you may want to go for an iPad Air 4, because that is going to probably give you a longer future ahead of it, and you'll probably run into less problems and get more power from an iPad Air 4 than an iPad 9. So in terms of performance, that pretty much covers it up here. Now, funny enough, the iPad 9th generation may actually give you better battery life than the iPad Air 4. Now, the main reason for this, it has a little bit of a smaller display, which kind of helps it, but you actually do get a bigger size battery on the iPad 9 than on the iPad, Air 4 by almost 1,000 milliamp hours, which is pretty impressive. So from my experience and what I'm going to tell you is, I kind of found the battery life to be kind of the same, but you're definitely, from the numbers here, you're probably going to be getting better battery life from the 9th gen iPad than the iPad Air 4 in my opinion. So in terms of that covers it up here. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and buy an iPad Air 4? Should you buy an iPad 9th generation? Well, what I'll tell you is that without a doubt, I would highly recommend picking up an iPad Air 4. That is going to be the better iPad in pretty much every single way. It's going to be more powerful. Maybe it doesn't have better battery life than it, but it is a more premium feeling iPad. It has better cameras on the back. It has a longer future ahead of it. And like I said, that extra gig of RAM and that newer chipset, you're going to be getting better performance from it. But the 9th gen iPad is still extremely good too. I didn't really have too many complaints about it. And maybe the design is a little bit outdated. Maybe the camera on the back isn't that great. But for $329, you can't really go wrong with it. And I think it's a tremendous iPad for sure. If I had to pick up one, I'd rather have the iPad Air 4 for sure. But the 9th gen iPad, I think, is a better valued iPad when it comes down to it. So that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.